The day started like any other. The morning sun poured through the kitchen window as I brewed coffee, listening to the soft hum of the radio. Everything felt normal, safe. I didn't know that in just a few hours, my entire world would shatter. "Morning, babe," Daniel said, stepping into the kitchen with a sleepy smile. He wrapped his arms around me, pressing a lazy kiss to my temple. "Guess what? My DNA test results came in." I laughed, shaking my head as I poured our coffee. "I still don't understand why you even did that. You know your family history." Daniel grinned, leaning against the counter. "I just thought it'd be fun. I mean, what if I was secretly related to royalty?" I rolled my eyes playfully. "Yeah, sure. King of the couch, maybe." He chuckled, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Let's see what secrets my DNA holds." I went back to making breakfast, half listening as he clicked through the results. It was one of those silly things couples did together. Harmless, pointless. Just another ordinary day, until it wasn't. A sharp inhale from behind me made my hands freeze mid-motion. Then silence. A long, unnatural silence. I turned. Daniel was staring at his phone, his expression completely drained of color. His hands trembled. His eyes, wide, unblinking, were filled with something I'd never seen before. Dread. "Daniel?" My voice was cautious, careful. "What is it?" He didn't answer. My stomach tightened. I took a step closer, peeking at the screen. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Just columns of numbers, percentages, genetic markers. And then my eyes landed on one line. Paternal match. 0% confusion clouded my thoughts. "Wait, what does that mean?" Daniel staggered back, running a shaking hand through his hair. "It means..." His breath hitched. "It means my dad isn't my dad." The words hit me like a train. "What?" Daniel's hands clenched into fists, his breathing ragged. "It says the man who raised me, the man I've called my father for 32 years, isn't biologically related to me. At all." I grabbed the phone, reading the result over and over, as if the words might change. But they didn't. They never would. I swallowed hard. "Maybe it's a mistake." "It's not a mistake." His voice was flat, lifeless. "DNA doesn't lie." The air thickened around us, the weight of the revelation pressing down on my chest. "But that's impossible," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your parents, they've been together forever. Your dad, he adores you. There's no way." Daniel let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Apparently, there is." I felt the ground shift beneath me, because if Daniel's father wasn't really his father, then that meant his mother had been hiding a secret for over 3 decades. A secret so big, so devastating, that just knowing it could destroy their entire family. And now it was out. I reached for Daniel's hand, but he pulled away. His body was rigid, cold. I could already see it happening, the trust breaking, the anger rising. He wasn't just questioning his parents. He was questioning everything. "What are you going to do?" I whispered. His jaw clenched. His eyes burned with something raw, something dangerous. "I'm going to find out the truth." And with that, he grabbed his keys and walked out the door, leaving me behind in a house that no longer felt like home. The door slammed behind Daniel, leaving behind a deafening silence that pressed against my chest like a crushing weight. I stood frozen in place, my hands gripping the kitchen counter as if letting go would send me spiraling into the chaos that had just unfolded. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the proof was right there. A cold, emotionless line of text on a DNA report that had turned Daniel's entire life into a lie. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers, my heart pounding in my ears as I typed out a message. "Me. Daniel, please come back. Let's talk about this." No response. I tried again. "Me. Whatever you're thinking right now, don't do anything rash. We can figure this out together." Still nothing. I knew where he was going. There was only one place he could go. His parents' house. At his parents' house. Daniel barely stopped the car before jumping out, his pulse hammering in his throat as he stormed toward the front door. His childhood home stood just as it always had. White picket fence, neatly trimmed bushes, the faint scent of his mother's favorite roses lingering in the air. But it all felt like a lie now. He pounded on the door, once, twice, harder than necessary. Moments later, the door swung open, and there stood his mother, Carol Whitmore. Her face lit up at first, but the moment she saw the look in his eyes, her smile faltered. "Daniel? What's wrong?" His jaw clenched. "I took a DNA test," he said, his voice tight, barely controlled. "Just for fun." Carol's expression flickered. Something small, something almost imperceptible, but he caught it. A split second of fear. His stomach twisted. "And it turns out, Dad isn't my biological father." Silence. A suffocating, painful silence. Carol's lips parted, her face paling. And in that moment, Daniel knew. She didn't even have to say it. She already knew the truth. His chest tightened, rage and betrayal clawing at him. "Say something," he demanded, his voice breaking. "Tell me it's a mistake." Carol swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Daniel, sweetheart, listen to me." "Don't," he snapped, stepping back, his pulse roaring in his ears. "Just tell me the truth. Who is my real father?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I never wanted you to find out like this." His stomach dropped. "You knew," he whispered, his breath shaky. "You knew this whole time." Carol pressed her hands to her lips, shaking her head. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me." He stepped forward, his hands curling into fists. "Tell me what I'm supposed to think. That my whole life is a lie? That the man who raised me, who I thought was my father, isn't?" Carol's face crumpled, and a sob escaped her lips. "Daniel, please, I can explain." "Explain!" His voice cracked. "You've had 32 years to explain." The weight of his mother's betrayal suffocated him. The woman who had raised him, who had kissed his forehead every night as a child, who had held his hand through every scraped knee, had lied to him his entire life. "Who is he?" he choked out. Carol's shoulders trembled. Who is he?" he demanded again, his voice shaking. And then, a voice from behind them. "That would be me." Daniel turned sharply, standing at the end of the hallway, emerging from the shadow like a ghost from the past. Was a man Daniel had never seen before, but somehow he looked exactly like him. His heart stopped, and in that moment he realized the truth wasn't just painful, it was going to destroy everything. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the man standing before him, a stranger. Yet somehow, not a stranger at all. The man had the same sharp jawline, the same stormy blue eyes, the same tense way he clenched his fists when emotions ran high. It was like looking into a distorted mirror. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. "Who?" His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Who the hell are you?" The man stepped forward, his gaze heavy with something unreadable. "My name is James Calloway," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And he exhaled, looking at Carol before returning his gaze to Daniel. "I'm your father." Daniel staggered back. The words didn't make sense. They shouldn't make sense. This couldn't be real. He turned to his mother, searching for denial, for protest, anything that would make this nightmare go away. But Carol said nothing. Instead, she broke down into sobs, a guttural, heartbreaking sound that told Daniel everything he needed to know. It was true. Every single thing was true. His hands trembled. His chest ached like someone had taken a blade and carved a hole straight through his ribs. He turned back to James, anger searing through the grief. "You don't get to show up and say that," Daniel snapped, his voice thick with fury. "You don't get to walk in here after 32 years and act like I'm supposed to just accept this." James's expression remained neutral, but there was something, regret, pain, guilt, that flickered in his eyes. "You're right," he admitted. "You don't owe me anything, but I owe you the truth." Daniel let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "The truth?" His voice dripped with bitterness. "That's rich, considering my whole life has been a lie." Carol sobbed harder. "Daniel, please." He turned on her, his hands clenching into fists. Just don't." His mother, the woman he had loved unconditionally his entire life, was now a stranger. Everything he had ever believed, ever trusted, ever loved was gone. James sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I never meant for you to find out this way." Daniel barked a hollow laugh. "Oh? How exactly were you planning on telling me?" His voice shook with rage. "Or were you just going to let me die, never knowing the truth?" James exhaled slowly. "I never wanted to be absent from your life." Daniel froze, his jaw tightened. "What the hell does that mean?" James hesitated. His eyes flicked to Carol, and something passed between them. Something dark. Something Daniel wasn't supposed to know. "Say it," Daniel demanded, his heart pounding. "Say it, or I walk out that door and never come back." Carol looked away, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. James inhaled deeply. And then, "I never left you," he said. "Your mother kept me away." A silence so thick it choked the air. Daniel's stomach twisted violently. He shook his head, refusing to believe it. No, she wouldn't." James's voice remained steady. "I tried to be in your life, Daniel. I wanted to be your father. But Carol, she made sure that never happened." Carol let out a sob. Daniel staggered backward. His mother had done this. She had erased his real father. She had lied to him, stolen his truth, his childhood, his memories. All of it had been built on a foundation of lies. His entire life was a fabrication. His chest heaved. His fist shook. And then he snapped. "You lied to me," he hissed at Carol, his voice cold, sharp as glass. "You lied to me for 32 years. Carol's lips trembled. "I did it to protect you." Daniel's rage boiled over. "From what?" he exploded. "From my own father? From the truth?" Carol flinched, guilt carved into every line of her face. "I loved you," she whispered. "I wanted to keep our family together. I thought I was doing the right thing." Daniel let out a sharp breath, his chest rising and falling erratically. The right thing? How could she even say that? She had stolen from him, stolen his identity, his past, his father. He turned to James, his mind spinning. "If you wanted to be in my life so badly, why didn't you fight for me?" James hesitated. Then in a voice heavy with regret, he said, "Because she told me you were dead." Daniel's world collapsed. His knees buckled. His breath vanished. "What?" His voice came out strangled. "What did you just say?" James's jaw clenched. "She told me you had died at birth, that there was nothing I could do, that you—" He stopped, his voice breaking for the first time. He looked away, as if the weight of the words was too much to bear. Daniel turned back to Carol, his chest caving in. She didn't even deny it. She couldn't. Tears streamed down her face. "I was scared," she sobbed. "I was scared you'd leave me for him. I thought—" She shook her head violently. "I thought if you never knew, we could be happy." Daniel felt sick. His own mother had killed him in the eyes of his real father. His life, his identity, had been stolen before it even began. His hands trembled as he took one last look at both of them. Carol, the woman who had raised him and betrayed him. James, the man who should have been there, but never knew he had a son to fight for. His entire existence had been nothing but a carefully constructed lie, and now that lie had burned to the ground. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know who I am anymore." And with that, he turned and walked out the door. The cold air hit Daniel like a slap as he stumbled out of the house. His pulse roared in his ears, his breath ragged and uneven. His mother's sobs still echoed behind him, but he couldn't turn back. Not now, not after everything. The night sky stretched above him, vast and endless, but Daniel felt like he was drowning. Who was he? The man he had spent his entire life calling Dad. The man who had taught him how to ride a bike, who had cheered him on at soccer games, who had held him after his first heartbreak, wasn't his real father. And the man who was his father had spent 32 years believing he had died. The betrayal was suffocating. His mother's voice kept replaying in his head, her desperate, tear-soaked confession. "I thought if you never knew, we could be happy." Daniel let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Happy?" How the hell could she even say that? She had stolen his truth, stolen his father's right to know him, stolen everything. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone. He didn't even know who he was calling until he heard the ringing. One ring, two, three. Then a soft voice. Daniel? It was me, his wife, the woman who had spent the last 5 years building a life with him, loving him, and now that life was crumbling. His breath hitched. I don't know what to do. I felt my stomach twist. I had never heard him sound so broken. Where are you? I asked gently. Silence. Then, I don't know who I am. His voice cracked, and my heart shattered. I grabbed my keys. Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you. 30 minutes later, I found Daniel sitting on the hood of his car, his head in his hands. His whole body was tense, like he was barely holding himself together. I parked and rushed over. Daniel! He looked up, and the second I saw his face, I felt tears burn my eyes. He was wrecked, completely. His eyes were red, his jaw tight, his shoulders trembling. I reached for him, but he flinched. And that hurt. Talk to me, I whispered. He exhaled shakily, rubbing his face. I don't even know where to start. Then start from the beginning. He let out a bitter laugh. The beginning? You mean the beginning of a life that isn't even real? My heart ached. Daniel, my mom lied to me. He cut in, his voice sharp, raw. She told my real father I was dead. His breath came out uneven. She stole me from him. My whole life, everything I've ever known is a lie. Tears filled my eyes. I'm so sorry. But sorry wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough to fix this. I sat beside him, careful, hesitant. What happens now? Daniel stared at the dark road ahead. I don't know. I swallowed hard. Do you want to know him? His jaw tensed. I don't know. He was at war with himself. He had spent his whole life loving a man who wasn't his real father. And now he had a biological father who had spent 3 decades grieving a son who was never even dead. How do you even begin to process that? I hesitated before whispering, do you want me to be there when you talk to your dad? Daniel flinched. And then he laughed. But it wasn't a laugh. It was hollow, empty, broken. Which one? He asked. My chest tightened. Which one? The man who had raised him, or the man who had lost him? I had no answer, and neither did he. So I did the only thing I could. I reached out, slowly, carefully, and took his shaking hand in mine. I don't know what happens next, I whispered, but you don't have to figure it out alone. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, finally, his fingers tightened around mine. And in that small, fragile moment, I knew he was still Daniel. He was still my husband, and no DNA test could ever change that. The night air felt colder than before, wrapping around us like an invisible force. Daniel's grip on my hand was tight, as if I was the only thing keeping him from falling apart completely. I wanted to say something, anything that could ease his pain. But how do you comfort someone whose entire existence has just been rewritten? His voice broke the silence first. I keep thinking. His jaw clenched, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. If I had never taken that stupid DNA test, I'd still be happy. I'd still be normal. My chest tightened. Daniel, I started, but he shook his head. Do you know what hurts the most? His voice was raw, hoarse. It's not just that she lied, it's that she let me love him. I knew who he meant, his dad, the man who had raised him, loved him, taught him everything he knew. The man who had no idea that his own wife had stolen his son from another man. Daniel exhaled shakily. He has no idea. None. His fingers curled into a fist. How the hell am I supposed to tell him? The weight of his words crushed me, because he was right. His father, the only father he had ever known, had spent his entire life believing a lie too. And when the truth came out, it would destroy him. I squeezed Daniel's hand. You don't have to tell him right now. His breath was unsteady. But I have to tell him eventually. I hesitated. Do you think your mom will tell him first? Daniel let out a bitter laugh. She's been lying for 32 years. What makes you think she'd suddenly tell the truth now? A cold shiver ran through me. He was right. His mother had spent decades building a life on lies, and now those lies were about to burn everything to the ground. The next day, at his parents' house, Daniel stood outside the door, his body rigid with tension. I stayed a step behind, my heart pounding in my chest. He had barely slept last night. Neither had I. But this was something he had to do, something he needed to do. Finally, he knocked. Seconds later, the door creaked open. His father stood there. Richard Whitmore was a man built from years of hard work and quiet strength. His once dark hair was streaked with gray, his eyes kind. But today they flickered with concern. "Daniel?" His brow furrowed as he stepped aside. "Come in, son." "Son." Daniel flinched. I saw it, the way the word cut into him now, like a blade straight to the heart. But he didn't correct him. Not yet. We stepped inside. The house smelled the same. Coffee, fresh linen, home. But it no longer felt like home to Daniel. "Where's Mom?" Daniel's voice was stiff, controlled. His dad sighed. "She's upstairs, said she wasn't feeling well." Daniel let out a cold breath. "Yeah, I bet she isn't." His dad frowned. "What's going on?" Daniel sat down at the kitchen table, his hands clasped together. He was trying to steady himself, but I could see the way his fingers trembled. I sat beside him, placing a hand on his knee. Richard sat across from us, confusion etched into his features. "Daniel, you're scaring me. What is this about?" Daniel lifted his gaze, and then he broke. Tears filled his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. His voice shook as he whispered, "Dad, I'm not your son." A stunned silence filled the room. Richard let out a soft, confused chuckle. "What? Daniel, what are you talking about?" Daniel's throat bobbed. "I took a DNA test yesterday, and it said we aren't related." His father's face drained of color. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at his son like he had just spoken in a foreign language. Then slowly he shook his head. "Number, that's impossible." Daniel clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. "Mom, she lied. She had an affair. And when she got pregnant, she told my real father that I was dead." Richard's breathing turned ragged. His hands shook violently as he pushed back from the table. "No," his voice cracked. "Number, I raised you. You're my son." Daniel's face twisted in pain. "I thought so too." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was never true. Richard's chest heaved. His face turned ashen, unreadable. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Daniel shot up from his chair. "Dad!" But the door slammed behind him. And just like that, Daniel had lost two fathers in one day. The slam of the door echoed through the house, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. Daniel stared after his father, his breathing ragged, his hands clenched into fists. I stood beside him, watching as his body shook with emotion. Anger, grief, devastation. Richard Whitmore had just walked away, without a word, without looking back, and it broke Daniel in a way nothing else ever had. Outside, Richard's breakdown. Daniel hesitated for just a second before rushing after him. He burst through the front door, stepping onto the porch just in time to see his father leaning against his car, his shoulders heaving with deep, uneven breaths. His back was to us, but I could hear the pain in every exhale. Daniel froze. I could tell he had never seen his father like this before. Richard Whitmore was a man who never cracked, never broke, but right now he was unraveling. Daniel stepped forward cautiously. "Dad!" Richard flinched at the word. Daniel swallowed hard. "I know this is..." He paused, struggling to find the words. "I know this is a lot, but please don't walk away from me. I'm still..." His voice caught. "I'm still your son." Richard whirled around, and the look in his eyes shattered Daniel, because for the first time in his life, Richard Whitmore looked at him like he was a stranger. "Are you..." His voice was hoarse, raw. "Are you really..." Daniel's breath hitched. Dad, please. Richard shook his head, stepping back. 32 years. 32 years I raised you. I loved you. I did everything a father was supposed to do. His voice cracked. And now I find out you're not even mine? Daniel staggered back like he had been slapped. Richard's hands trembled. Do you know what this means? His face twisted in anguish. It means my whole life was a lie too. Daniel felt like the ground had vanished beneath him. He had been so consumed with his own pain, his own loss of identity, that he hadn't stopped to think. His father had just lost a son too. Tears burned in Daniel's eyes. Dad, I don't care what a DNA test says. You raised me. You are my father. Richard let out a broken breath. But I wasn't supposed to be. The words cut like a knife. Daniel stepped forward, but Richard stepped back. I need time, he whispered. I need to. I don't know. I just need to go. Daniel shook his head. Dad, please. But Richard Whitmore climbed into his car, and this time, when he drove away, Daniel knew he wasn't coming back. The aftermath. The drive home was silent. Daniel didn't speak. I didn't push him to. I could feel his pain, see the way his hands clenched into fists in his lap. He stared out the window the entire time, his jaw tight, his body stiff. I knew he was barely holding himself together, and I knew that if I said the wrong thing, he would shatter. When we finally reached our house, he got out of the car without a word. I followed, my heart aching for him. Inside, he walked straight to the living room, sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. I sat beside him. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, he whispered the words that broke me. I lost both of them today. Tears welled in my eyes. No, you didn't. He let out a sharp, broken laugh. Didn't I? My real father never knew I existed. And the man who raised me, he doesn't even want to look at me now. His voice cracked. I don't belong anywhere. I grabbed his hand. You belong here, with me. He exhaled shakily, his fingers curling around mine. But his eyes, his beautiful broken eyes, told me the truth. He didn't know who he was anymore, and I didn't know if I could fix that. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him go through this alone. I pulled him close, wrapping my arms around him as he finally let himself break. For the first time since this nightmare began, he let himself cry, and I held him, because that was all I could do.